If she responds as we anticipate, the bipolar perspective will be intact. In our Tucson, Arizona bedroom, I was folding Dean's shirts when the message notification appeared on his laptop screen. His favorite blue button-down shirt, which he wore to dinner dates and parent-teacher conferences, had a collar that froze my hands. I could see a glimpse of what appeared to be a legal email on the laptop that was open on his bedside. I'm Teresa Mlan, and I'm 45 years old. I've been married to Dean, a successful construction project manager at Gravora Group, for the last 18 years. We have 2 kids, Ryan, 14, and Katie, 16, and I believed our marriage was strong since it was based on cooperation and trust. Even though Dean frequently griped about the meager pay it offered, I enjoy my job as a part-time veterinary technician at a nearby animal clinic. I insisted on maintaining some professional independence, but he preferred it when I managed the household and his demands from home full-time. While Dean was allegedly at a meeting on a construction site that Tuesday afternoon in October, I was doing what I always did, taking care of our house. When that message showed up, the home was peaceful, the kids were at school, and I was doing some washing. The word bipolar made my stomach knot for some reason. Although I had never received a diagnosis of that kind, Dean had recently made remarks about my erratic behavior and mood swings whenever I questioned his long hours or weekend getaways. My heart pounded in my chest as I gazed at the laptop screen. The name of the sender, Harrison and Associates Legal, was accessible. Dean had never brought up the idea of employing a lawyer for anything, much less one with mental health diagnoses. After those terrifying words, the message preview ended, but I could still see that the thread contained more emails. I sat down, the garment I had been folding with shaking hands. My natural reaction was to shut down the laptop and act as though I hadn't seen anything. I had accepted Dean's insistence on keeping his business affairs confidential throughout our marriage, but felt different, had a personal touch. The phrase bipolar kept coming back to me, and I became uneasy when I realized that Dean had been recording every dispute we'd had recently, every time I'd yelled or become irritated. Something changed inside of me as I stood in our master bedroom, surrounded by the life we had created together, the wedding ring on my finger, the vacation mementos on the shelf, and the family pictures on the dresser. The woman who had always trusted and believed in her husband was going to realize how mistaken she had been about everything. I ought to have left that laptop alone. It was Tuesday, and I should have gone downstairs and carried on as usual. Instead, my cursor was hovering over the email thread while I sat on the edge of our bed. The increasing dread in my stomach demanded answers, yet the logical portion of my mind cried out cautions. Dean and I had 20 years ago, during a cookout in Phoenix that was thrown by mutual friends, I met Dean. He treated me as if I were the most important person in the room and was ambitious. He used flowers, unexpected dinners, and lengthy discussions about our future together to court me. After 2 years of dating, I felt like the happiest woman alive when he asked me to marry him. Our first few years of marriage were everything I could have imagined. We traveled together, helped each other with our jobs, and purchased our first home in Tucson. However, things started to shift somewhere along the line. Since he made more money, Dean got more in charge of his finances and insisted on making all important decisions. He began to doubt my friendships, especially with my roommate from college, Jennifer, whom he accused of being a negative influence who constantly bombarded me with feminist rubbish. He was overjoyed when I became pregnant with Katie, but he also took advantage of the situation to persuade me to temporarily leave my position at the veterinary clinic. That brief pause continued for 6 years. After 3 years of returning to work, Dean expressed his discontent. He grumbled about the house not being as tidy as it was when I was home full-time, about having to pick up the kids from activities, and about dinner being late. He began implying that I was overwhelmed and struggling to cope with stress by making subtle remarks regarding my emotional state. He would sadly shake his head and say things like, "You don't even realize how scattered you've become," when I pointed out that I was doing just fine. I nearly believed him because of how skillfully and gradually he gaslighted me. I began to question my responses, wondering if I was acting irrationally or too sensitively. Dean was an expert at making his control seem like protection and his criticism seem like concern. He had mastered the art of using words that caused me to doubt judgment. However, after looking at that email preview, I came to the conclusion that he might have been creating something far worse than I had ever thought. The term bipolar angle implied a strategic approach rather than a haphazard concern for my welfare. What more was Dean planning to do if he was secretly consulting lawyers over my mental health? As I clicked on the email, my hands became more stable. Living in ignorance was no longer an option, but whatever I was about to learn would hurt. I reflected on Katie and Ryan, the life we had created together, and the person I was before Dean persuaded me to examine every aspect of who I was. I needed to my spouse was planning an attack. When the email opened, a universe I had never heard of appeared. There were dozens of files in the Exit Plan Confidential folder. As I scanned through document after document, each one more terrible than the last, my breath seized in my throat. There were financial spreadsheets I had never seen, communications between Dean and his lawyer, and what looked to be a comprehensive divorce timeline. However, the text messages were the sages that chilled my blood. "She lacks the intelligence to properly conceal money." 3 days prior, Dean had written to a man named Harrison, "When I'm done, this pitiful cow will be living in a trailer." It took me 2 readings to fully comprehend the text. What a pathetic cow. That's how my 18-year-old husband perceived me. I was viewed as nothing more than cattle to be thrown away by the man who claimed to love me, kissed me goodbye every morning, and sat across from me at supper every night. However, the brutality was only the start. I was looking through the files when a terrifying image appeared. For months, if not longer, Dean had been preparing for this divorce. He had been methodically assembling evidence to portray me as mentally ill, recording every disagreement, every outburst, and every instance in which I had yelled or displayed emotion. Twisted versions of our talks were included in the emails. He sent to his lawyer, portraying me as unstable, illogical, and unsuitable to have custody of our kids. Harrison's response was, "The bipolar diagnosis will be key. We need more documentation of erratic behavior. Can you provoke some incidents?" Provoke incidents. I reflected on the last few months, how Dean had been provoking me, starting pointless disputes, and then stepping back with that cool-headed composure as I became irritated. I considered how he had begun to doubt my recollection of conversations and occurrences, and how he had started to imply that I was exaggerating everything. It had been a deliberate effort to undermine my credibility, not gaslighting resulting from dysfunction. Even more advanced was the financial planning. Dean had been concealing assets, transferring funds to accounts I was unaware of, and getting ready to argue that my careless spending had exhausted our shared savings. Emails with receipts attached, things I had never bought, and charges I had never made were all there. Support the charge of mental illness, He was fabricating a story about financial irresponsibility. The custody plan Dean and Harrison had devised, however, was possibly the most terrifying. It was a scheme to use my work schedule against me, turn my independence into neglect, and paint Dean as the responsible, stable dad who had been taking care of his unstable wife for years. They had a deadline of 90 days to get me out of the house and away from my kids. I felt clarity, something I hadn't felt in years, as I sat in our bedroom in silence, surrounded by the rubble of my broken marriage. Now everything made sense. The uncertainty, the self-doubt, the ongoing worry about senses. I was being methodically destroyed by someone who was meant to love me. I wasn't going insane. I understood exactly what I had to do for the first time in months. When Dean came in that evening, asking me about my day, I didn't yell or confront him. I kissed his cheek instead and inquired about his encounter. I kept a close eye on his expression as he fabricated yet another falsehood regarding site inspections and customer consultations. He was unaware that I had caught him in the act, and I wanted to keep it that way. After Dean dozed off next to me that night, I lay in the dark strategizing my next course of action. Gathering evidence was my reaction, but I needed to be strategic. I had to catch up to Dean without telling him what I knew, because he was obviously a few steps ahead of me. When my children's future was on the line, I couldn't allow emotion to influence my choices. I returned Dean's laptop the following morning, after he had left for work and the children had gone to school. I had my phone and a flash drive with me this time. I took screenshots of every text message, meticulously duplicated every file in the exit plan folder, and recorded every email discussion between Dean and Harrison. The even more terrible in the light of day. For more than 8 months, Dean had been organizing this. While I was preparing Valentine's Day dinner and organizing our anniversary trip, he had been working with Harrison since February, developing financial plans and arguing for custody. He had initially intended to file for divorce in December, just before Christmas, when I would be at my most emotionally vulnerable, according to the timeline. I was astounded by the deliberate cruelty. As I dug deeper into the documents, however, I discovered a catastrophic flaw in Dean's plan. He had totally underestimated me. His whole plan was predicated on the idea that I was emotionally unstable, passive, and uninformed about money. He recorded what he believed to be proof of my mental health problems, but when I read his accounts, I saw something else entirely. The actions of a woman who had been gaslighted and controlled for years. I recalled more the more I read. Dean had insisted that we refinance the house, obtain better rates 3 months prior. I had trusted his knowledge and signed the documents he presented to me. Now I realized that part of his asset hiding scheme had been refinancing. He persuaded me to transfer all of my savings into our joint account and close my personal savings account 2 months ago, improve our financial planning. The funds had been surreptitiously transferred to an account I had never seen. However, Dean had made a critical error. He had meticulously documented everything out of conceit. Every falsehood, deception, and ruthless computation was captured on digital media. I would protect myself by using words as weapons. I considered phoning my former college roommate, Jennifer, whom Dean had managed to keep me apart from. I considered phoning my sister in California, with whom I had lost touch following Dean's covert campaign against her. I initially needed legal counsel, though. I needed someone who could explain to me what I was up against and how to combat it. I took out my phone and looked up Tucson divorce lawyers, but I quickly stopped. Dean was familiar with the legal community. Harrison had been singled out by him because of his history of using forceful divorce procedures. I needed someone outside of Dean's network, someone he wouldn't think of. I suddenly recalled something from the files I had previously perused. Harrison had brought up a Phoenix-based woman lawyer who had caused him problems in a past case. He had described her as unforgiving and unflappable. According to Harrison's irate letters, she was Victoria Summers, and she had meticulously dissected his client's case. For the first time in days, I grinned. I needed Victoria Summers on my side if she was causing Harrison nightmares. The Phoenix office of Victoria Summers was not at all like the impersonal business settings I had anticipated. Law books and family. Photographs lined the walls, and Victoria, a beautiful woman in her 50s with silver hair and piercing blue eyes that seemed to see everything, was the focal point. Her secretary managed to fit me into her schedule when I called that morning, and now I sit across from her desk with a manila envelope full of proof in my lap. I'd rehearsed what I wanted to say during the hour-long drive to Phoenix, but now that I was here, the words caught in my throat. "Before we begin," Victoria said in a kind but professional tone, "I want you to know that everything you share with me is protected by attorney-client privilege. You're safe here. If your entire marriage has been a lie, how would you explain it? How do you acknowledge that you were so completely duped that you started to doubt sanity?" When I eventually said, "My husband is planning to divorce me," Victoria's face remained the same, but I saw a sharpening of her eyes as she said, "He's been building a case to prove I'm mentally unstable and unfit for custody. He wants to take everything, the house, the kids, and our savings, and he thinks I'm too stupid to stop him. Tell me everything." I spent the next hour thoroughly outlining Dean's strategy. I showed Victoria the financial paperwork, the texts, and the emails. I described how, for months, Dean had been gaslighting me, recording my responses, and starting disputes. I informed her about the phony invoices, the secret accounts, and the methodical exclusion from loved ones. Victoria slumped back in her chair when I was done. "This is one of the most comprehensive coercive control cases I've seen," she whispered quietly. "Your husband isn't just planning a divorce, he's planning to destroy you." "But he can't really prove I'm bipolar, can he?" I responded. Victoria's sly smirk said, "I've never been diagnosed with anything. Teresa, your husband just handed us his entire playbook. Not only can we defend against his accusations, we can go on the offensive. What he's doing is called litigation abuse, and it's grounds for sanctions. The hidden assets alone could result in criminal charges." She took out a legal pad and began. "They will record the psychological abuse you have experienced. First, we're going to get you evaluated by a forensic psychologist, someone who specializes in coercive control. Secondly, we will track down all of your husband's financial transactions over the last 12 months. Third, before he can carry out his scheme, we will apply for emergency custody and protective orders. Is all of that possible for us?" Hardly daring to hope, I asked. "Teresa, your husband made a critical error. He documented his intent to commit fraud and perjury. He put his plans in writing. Any judge who sees this evidence will be furious." Victoria's voice was encased in silk and steel. "By the time we're done, Dean won't know what hit him." I felt power, something I hadn't felt in years, as I drove back to Tucson. I had been gasping for oxygen and feeling like I was drowning for a long time, while Dean kept my head submerged. Abruptly, I was able to breathe once more. I had a strategy, an ally, and, above all, the truth. However, I was also aware that the most hazardous portion was only getting started. Dean and uninformed. He would escalate when he understood I was retaliating, and when he learned I had located his files. Victoria had warned me that when abusers realized they were losing power, they became much more deadly. My thoughts turned to Katie and Ryan and how I could shield them from the impending storm. I reflected on the person I was before Dean persuaded me to question every aspect of who I was. Despite years of deception, that woman was still alive and stronger as a result of her survival. Dean was going to get the battle he had hoped for. Dr. Patricia Chen was the forensic psychologist Victoria suggested. Wait, that name was on the list of prohibited names. Dr. Patricia Walsh, who had offices in downtown Phoenix, was an expert in coercive control and domestic abuse. To avoid it appearing on our insurance records, I paid cash and made the appointment, using my maiden name. I was using my secretiveness, which Dean had taught me, against him. I was instantly comfortable with Dr. Walsh, a kind woman in her 60s. She did a thorough interview regarding my marriage and gave me a battery of psychological tests during our first appointment. As I explained Dean's tendencies, the gaslighting, the isolation, the methodical eroding of my self-esteem, Dr. Walsh gave a sympathetic nod. It felt like a release from a prison I was unaware I was in when she said, "Teresa, following our second session, you're not bipolar. What you're experiencing is complex trauma from ongoing psychological abuse. Your reactions aren't signs of mental illness. They're normal responses to abnormal circumstances." Dean had persuaded me for years that my feelings were improper, my responses were out of control, and my views were faulty. Now a professional was informing me that, considering what I had been through, my responses had been quite reasonable. Victoria, meanwhile, was doing her own magic. She had employed a forensic accountant who meticulously tracked down Dean's financial transactions, including the concealed accounts and the transferred assets. False costs. Every detail was recorded and examined. As it turned out, Dean had carefully siphoned out approximately $200,000 over the previous 2 years, hiding it from our shared assets. During our third meeting, Victoria informed me that your husband might be charged with wire fraud, money laundering, and perjury if he attempts to deny the existence of these assets. However, this is what we will do in its place. She presented a plan that was so elegant, it was stunning. Instead of going straight after Dean, we were going to let him use his own strategy to get a divorce first. We would have documentation demonstrating that each accusation was false when he presented his meticulously constructed lies to the court. We would provide proof of the concealed accounts when he claimed to be experiencing financial difficulties. He used Dr. Walsh's evidence regarding coercive control to support his claim that I was unfit for custody. Victoria said, "The judge will see that your husband planned to defraud you and the court system for months." But the most rewarding aspect of the strategy was what Victoria referred to as the nuclear option. That doesn't just hurt his credibility. It can result in sanctions, criminal referrals, and emergency protective orders. We may contend that Dean was practicing medicine without a license if he attempted to diagnose me with bipolar disorder without providing any supporting medical documentation. It constituted criminal fraud if he provided fictitious medical records. In any case, he would be destroyed by his own plan. As October gave way to November, I went about my daily business as I surreptitiously developed our case. I took care to avoid acting in a way that would reveal my knowledge to Dean. I asked him about his day while I carried on with my dinner preparation and laundry. On the inside, though, I was someone else entirely. Cold resolve took the place of the self-doubt. Dean was unaware that his pitiful cow had developed teeth. Protecting Katie and Ryan while keeping them unaware of the impending disaster in our house was the most difficult aspect. I ensured that all of their vital records, including birth certificates, social security cards, and academic transcripts, were safely stored in a deposit box that Dean was unaware of. Claiming it was a fun vacation rather than a calculated maneuver, to keep them out of the line of fire, I surreptitiously made arrangements for them to spend Christmas break with my sister in California. Everything was coming together. According to Dean's calendar, he intended to file for divorce on December 15th, just before the holidays, when he believed I would be at my most delicate. He was unaware that I would be prepared for him. As I brewed coffee and waited, the Arizona sun shone through our kitchen windows on the unseasonably warm 15th of December. At breakfast, Dean had been particularly upbeat, humming as he prepared for work, likely in anticipation of the bombshell he would later deliver. Before departing, he gave me a forehead kiss, as he had done every morning for the past 18 years, and informed me that he would be working late once more. The process server showed up at my veterinary clinic at 2 p.m. My colleagues appeared worried. I simply grinned and stated that it was most likely having to do with Dean's construction work as I signed the paperwork. Even though I knew what I would discover inside the envelope, I waited until I was by myself before opening it. Victoria had been right about the divorce petition. Because of my unpredictable conduct and mental fragility, Dean was requesting full custody of Katie and Ryan. He said that I had been spending excessively, exhausting our savings and causing chaos in the house. The statement stated that he was asking the court to take into account my history of emotional outbursts when deciding custody arrangements, and that he was seeking modest spousal support because of his limited financial circumstances. All of the accusations were identical to those we had seen in his files. Every deception was expertly constructed, and every manipulation was exactly what we had anticipated. I immediately gave Victoria a ring. "He filed," was all I said. "Perfect," was her response. When Dean returned home that evening with flowers and his well-known worried husband expression, he said, "How are you feeling?" Honestly relieved. "It's finally starting." He took my hands in his, sat me down in our living room, and gave the performance of his life. His words were so convincing and sincere that I briefly questioned memory. "Teresa, honey, I need to talk to you about something difficult. I think our marriage is in trouble, and I believe you might need professional help. Your behavior lately has been concerning, and I'm worried about the kids." I felt disgusted as I recalled the text about being a pathetic cow. "You're absolutely right," I remarked, observing his countenance change to one of bewilderment. The preliminary hearing was set for January 8th. "I think I do need help. In fact, I've already started getting it." That morning, Dean and Harrison entered the Puma County Courthouse together, both men exuding assurance. Dean had the endearing smile that had won me over 20 years ago, and he was dressed in his finest suit. He gave the judge a respectful nod and portraying the worried husband. Victoria then made her way into the courtroom. As Harrison whispered passionately in Dean's ear, I saw his face shift as he recognized her, not instantly, but with increasing terror. I was being represented by the same lawyer who had destroyed Harrison's earlier cases, the one he had referred to as hard to intimidate. With the cool efficiency of someone who had done this 1,000 times, Victoria came to the bench holding a thick binder marked "Intent to Defraud and Coercive Control Evidence Package A." She delivered copies to the judge and opposing counsel. As Victoria methodically presented evidence against him, including the fabricated incidents, the manipulated emails, the strategy sessions with Harrison, the hidden financial accounts, and the phony receipts, Dean's confident smile started to wane. "Your Honor," Victoria said, her voice echoing clearly throughout the courtroom, "before we address Mr. Milan's petition, there are some irregularities the court needs to see. Lastly, there are the SMS messages. Please refer to Exhibit 15 where Mr. Milan describes his wife as a pathetic cow and explains his intention to abandon her to live in a trailer." There was no sound in the courtroom. Dean's face turned white, red, and then white once again. Harrison seems to want to vanish into the ground. With every bit of evidence, Judge Patricia Morrison's face became more icy. The judge turned to face Dean as Victoria concluded her presentation. With a voice as harsh as shards of glass, she said, "Mr. Milan, would you mind explaining these communications?" Dean's lips moved silently in and out. "Wait, this isn't what it looks like," he stammered. At last, but everyone in that courtroom knew that was precisely what it looked like. Judge Morrison froze all of Dean's hidden accounts until an investigation was conducted and granted me temporary custody of the children and temporary ownership of the marital residence. In addition, she sent his case to the district attorney's office for possible criminal charges and mandated that he be evaluated psychologically. Dean's well-thought-out escape plan had backfired on him. He was arguing with Harrison fiercely in the hallway as we were leaving the courthouse, and I could sense the panic in his voice. The 4 financial irregularities, perjury, and contempt of court. I felt lighter than I have in years when I stepped outside into the Arizona sunshine. The house was mine. Katie and Ryan were safe in California with my sister, and I was free for the first time in decades. 6 months later, the divorce was finalized. Dean lost his reputation, half the assets, and custody. He was also charged with money laundering and fraud. Harrison almost lost his license after receiving a sanction from the state bar. In my case, I sold the Tucson house, continued working at the veterinary clinic, and relocated to a smaller area close to Phoenix, where Victoria had offered me a part-time position as a victim advocate. Ryan and Katie adapted well to our new existence, and I started mending the bonds Dean had methodically shattered. In retrospect, that Dean's biggest error was not underestimating me, but rather chronicling his brutality to such an extent that it was impossible to ignore. His remarks, captured in digital amber, acted as the proof that set me free after 18 years of coercion and control. That Tuesday afternoon in October, when I first received that laptop message, is something I think about a lot. Dean's web of falsehoods still held the woman who had discovered those files. 6 months later, different woman emerged from that courthouse, one who recalled her past self before Dean persuaded her to question everything about it. I learned that often the individuals who harm us the most are the ones who unintentionally provide us with the means to save ourselves, even though the road to freedom had taken me through the most treacherous places.